BRICS coalition, which have 6 new members that are going to join January 1st, 2024. Previously, we already had Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa joined in 2010. This has been a conception since the early 2000s. So it's not like this is something that's new necessarily. We just had a 15th summit in South Africa. If people followed that, it was telecast a lot of places. I know the U.S. media may not have paid as much attention to it, but this was a major event, this 15th summit that occurred in South Africa. We had 6 new members: Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. Very resource induced countries. When we talk about natural resources, we talk about the population of the world. With those new groups added, I don't know how much that would be, but even with just the 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, you're talking about over a quarter of the world's population, just in 5 countries, and a lot of political clout and economic clout as well. And so I guess my question would be, what does this do to disrupt the system here, the Western hegemony, and these talks of de-dollarization with all these different countries jumping on board with this BRICS coalition?
Yeah, well, if you notice, all those countries recently joined are heavily oil producers as well, you know. Well, it marks a real serious challenge to the institutions of the U.S. global economic empire, right? The BRICS expanded the way they are, and I believe others will join. I mean, if Egypt and UAE and Saudi Arabia join, Turkey will eventually join. If Argentina and Brazil and Latin America are, well, some of the Andean and Venezuela will join. And who knows who is going to join from Asia, maybe Indonesia, okay? So this thing is really becoming a political challenger analog to the US-dominated G7 and even G20, which are institutions where the US and its closest allies get together and plot out their control of the world. The G7 is just a US backyard, obviously, you know, Europe and Japan and the US and Canada. G20 is a little broader, and you've got a number of countries in the G20 who probably will join the BRICS as well and have a position in both, you know, but that's a weakening of US institutions. And what it represents is what's going to happen with de-dollarization. Clearly, these countries are going to try to remove themselves from hegemony of the US dollar. You see, heretofore, most of US trade, virtually global trade, most of global trade, especially trade in commodities and energy, had to be done with the dollar. You had to get dollars in order to buy oil. You had to get dollars to buy, you know, metal commodities and grains and so forth. When you have an expanded BRICS like this, they will have their own currency. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we'll see something fairly soon, probably based on oil. Petro, it'll be a kind of a petro currency with maybe a few, maybe Chinese yuan and petro currency. And there will be buying, purchasing, trading in kind, you know, using their own domestic currencies. It remains to be seen, but whatever happens, it means a big blow to the US dollar. And the dollar is a linchpin of the global US economic empire. If the dollar declines as a trading currency, it will decline as a reserve currency. And if that's the case, countries will want fewer dollars. If that's the case, countries won't want to buy dollars in order to buy US treasuries, right? Because you got to buy dollars if you got to buy treasuries. There'll be fewer dollars, they'll cost more, so they won't want to buy them, and they won't buy US treasuries. Now you follow this trend. If They aren't, if the world is not buying US treasuries, and China is already reducing its holdings by hundreds of billions of treasuries. But if the world is not buying US treasuries, the US cannot finance its annual $1 trillion plus budget deficits. Right? That's how it finances these trillion and a half deficits. We don't raise enough taxes because we're giving all these tax cuts for the rich to cover our expenditures. But other countries will recycle their dollars back to the US buying treasuries. And that's where they get the trillion and a half that they actually end up spending, you see? So the budget deficit won't be able to be covered if the dollar collapses in the world. Now, if the budget deficit already at 1.5 trillion chronically is not, gets worse, which it will, it's going to hit $43 trillion deficit debt, national debt. National debt is just the accumulation of annual deficits. If we're going to run trillion and a half deficit, as far as the eye can see, the national debt's going to be huge here in a few years. And that means, well, the US is going to have to cut its spending or raise taxes. The elites don't want to raise the taxes that Trump gave them, $5 trillion tax cuts. The US has cut taxes $15 trillion since 2001. $15 trillion. Yeah. I mean, our debt is 33 trillion, but $15 trillion. Right? The wars have cost us about 7 to 8 trillion. There's 22 trillion right there of the $34 trillion national debt right now. You throw in the social programs for the crisis of 2008-9 and the COVID crisis, and then you throw in pharmaceutical and health companies gouging Medicare, Medicaid, right? There's your $34 trillion right there. They've been able to finance it because the other countries are buying treasuries. When they stop buying treasuries, how are you going to finance it? Oh, then you got to either cut defense or raise taxes or really go after social discretionary spending or even non-discretionary, which means you're going to have to go after Social Security. I mean, these are real crises of major proportions that are around the corner if the dollar collapses as the global currency. If the dollar collapses as the preferred global currency, then you're facing other institutions of the global economic empire in trouble as well, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, the US uses what's called the SWIFT International Payment System. SWIFT allows the US to see through the US banks and foreign banks who is violating the sanctions, who is buying Russian oil, who isn't with the SWIFT. But if the BRICS have their own currency, they'll have their own international payment system, and the US will never be able to see who's violating the sanctions. I think that's why a lot of these countries that do oil are very interested in joining the BRICS, because there's going to be a currency based on oil, right? And they can do what the hell they want, buying and selling, trading with each other. The US won't have any idea if the sanctions work. They hardly work now anyway, but they won't work. Now that's a big weapon, direct weapon, sanctions of the US empire. In other words, it's gone. That weapon is essentially gone, right? And then you got institutions like IMF and World Bank, and there will be those parallel institutions already, an IMF-like BRIC institution that will loan money to other countries to protect their currencies. I mean, it's almost, you got to have an IMF-like institution if you have an alternative currency and payment system. They go hand in hand. Well, now what you're seeing is the collapse of the institutions of the global economic empire of the United States. History will show that Biden accelerated this process through his sanctions and war. Biden has done more to destroy the US economic empire than Russia or anybody else could ever have done. That's why I say the neocons are so stupid. The neocons are so blind in their policies that they're destroying their own empire. I mean, as far as economics, they're ignorant, or they know it and they think geopolitics is more important, you see. So, that wraps up my sort of analysis of the BRICS. It's the symbol, the harbinger for all these other things that are going to follow suit because there's the BRICS, right? And key is it's going to undermine the US dollar as the global trading and therefore reserve currency, which sets in motion all these other crises, like how do you finance the deficit? How do you finance the debt, right? And if you keep keeping interest rates, the Fed is keeping interest rates, by the way, up 5.5, it's going to rise. The interest rates are going to go up. I've been saying that further. But what about the interest on the debt as part of the annual deficit? In 2019, it was like $250 billion a year. It's 600 billion now, and it's going to 900 billion. So you can just imagine, you can't sell your treasuries to get this dollar flow back to cover your deficit. And that deficit's ballooning because of war and because of interest on the debt going through the roof, right? And what are you going to do? You take it out on the American people with their social programs? Yeah, but that can't even come close. You got to have to raise taxes on the rich, campaign contributions. They're not going to do that either. They're between a rock and a hard place, I think. And we are on the edge of an acceleration of the decline of the empire for these reasons. Fiscal and monetary policy are in deep crisis. They're not working very well. And you got increasing, income disparities going on. This quote recovery, we can go into that. We don't have time, is really a fake. This thing that these Bidenomics talking about, all things are so great in terms of jobs, inflation, and what inflation is going to creep back up. Already we could see it happening. Global crude oil is approaching $100 a barrel. It's at 92, approaching $100 a barrel. They can't get services inflation down. Services report in the U.S. just came out today. Services are expanding, they're not contracting. The next CPI report will show even higher services inflation. Services are 80% of the economy, U.S. economy. They've been stuck at 5 to 6% inflation rate for 4 months now, and now they're going to creep back up. And now energy prices are going to creep back up. The Fed has raised interest rates to 5.5%, and this is what they got for it. They're going to have to raise it a hell of a lot more. But if they raise rates a hell of a lot more, they further destabilize the regional banking crisis in the US. So monetary policy is full of contradictions, and so is fiscal policy. But it's all an indication, reflection of the decline of the empire.